Okay, I have a few announcements. I'll explain what we're going to do today. I don't know if this is an announcement so much as it is just an observation. Phyllis was asking me for a reference on evolution, and I had bought this book a few years ago, What Evolution Is by Ernst Mayr. Ernst Mayr is a huge figure in the study of evolution in the 20th century, and he wrote this sort of as in an effort to provide a thorough yet easy to understand discussion of the background on evolution and what have you. For the longest time, I gave copies of it to my grad students. Did I give you guys copies of this book? All right, well, I owe you copies of that. And the other book you're supposed to get is Elements of Style. Did I give you that? Yeah, you guys, I owe you some books. I wanted to recommend it to you if you have more than a passing interest in evolution, because it's without question the best single volume summary that I've read. And I suppose I should provide an incentive on this. If you guys actually read this book and will give me some sort of brief summary, and that can be verbal, not just written, I'll give you, gosh, let's say 25 points, which is as much as a whole assignment. So there you go. You've got to, Kelly and Amber have to help me remember. I should have written myself notes so I would remember the other issues I wanted to mention to you. I see that, and I think I read this article in The Guardian, I see that the city of Cape Town is turning off their piped water on the 16th of April. They've been in a long-term drought, and their reservoirs are now at a point where they simply cannot supply water to the city. And the thing that I found so striking in the story I read, which had an accompanying video, was that there are 4 million people in Cape Town, and about a million of them live in townships. The townships don't have water piped to the houses. There's just, I guess they're called standpipes. I don't know what you'd call them. And apparently people have they've been criticized for using too much water at these standpipes because they'd be left running and so forth. However, according to the city officials, only 4% of the city's water is used by the townships. 96% is used by the other 3 million who live in suburbs and live with swimming pools and gardens and vegetables and so forth. Now, what the city hopes happens is that when they turn the taps off, the government's going to provide free water, but a very limited amount. And Kelly stole my book because she wants to get an early edge on it. Good for her. So they think that conservation is going to fit this. But I think this is an important story to watch. The city of Sao Paulo, which is one of the largest cities in the world, came within a couple of months of running out of water 2 years ago. It shouldn't surprise us so much that it was in Cape Town, because Cape Town is more towards the polar extremes. So this is an example of the future. So what we're seeing there, you're going to see in a number of other cities around the world. So I think it's interesting and important to watch. Will suffer more than any other single group, but we'll see. So there's that unfortunate news that we should watch. I have some other things I want to post, and I've been struggling with how to do this in that I can't keep up with some of my other work. And so I'm going to lay an offer out for you guys. I could order the TAs to do things, but I've already got them pretty well committed. I think it would be useful if on the Canvas page we had links to some of the sites that you guys have individually sent me with pertinent information and so forth. So if you're interested in helping with this activity, I'm interested in either paying you or finding some other way. Free books that I buy for you or something. So see me after class if this is of interest. But I think it would add more dimension to the course if those things were posted, so as I talk about a topic, we have some additional materials besides the book. So I'll lay that out there. Today, 2 things. The first is going to be, as I promised, age structure. And that's what I'll talk about initially. I know there'll be an exam question on this, and I might have you do an assignment. And I'll tell you why I would do that. I'm going to tell you that you can predict the future by reading age structure diagrams. And the reason I would make an assignment was so that you have a chance to predict the future, to actually go through that process. The second thing I'm going to try to talk about in a very brief time is something called population regulation. Population regulation was an extraordinarily controversial topic, and I noticed they barely make mention of it in your book, which in some ways maybe is a sense of progress. But I want to give you a brief background on that. And before I came down from my office, I looked at I saved my ecology text from 1978, which is Krebs' second edition, The Distribution and Abundance of Animals, I think is what it is. And what I told you earlier this semester is right. Almost the entire book deals with nothing but population questions. And so this observation I made that population really dominated ecological thought is borne out by that. And there's many, many chapters in that book dealing with population regulation. And when I look at my grad school notes, we had the same thing when I was taking courses on insect ecology. And yet here I am hoping to dismiss it in an entire lecture. So we'll see how that goes. I'm going to sit down for most of this just because I'll be using the computer for some of these things. So, as you know, populations have some distribution of ages. And by that I mean the different ages of individuals in the population. For certain species that have a very specific generation time, we actually expect to see those ages move along in a set pattern. The term that we usually use with respect to a single age is a cohort, C-O-H-O-R-T. And the idea of a cohort is that they're individuals of the same age who move through together. You guys would represent one of my ecology cohorts. Even though you're not at the same class, you're taking this course at the same time. And this business of cohorts is used by insurance companies. It's a way to look at all sorts of populations. And in a sense, when people talk about millennials or baby boomers or whatever, Gen Xers and all these things, it's not exactly, it's much the same idea in a different context. As ecologists, age matters for a lot of important reasons. Your likelihood of living or dying depends upon your age. I guess formally that's called age-specific mortality, or if you're an optimist, age-specific survivorship. But it would be very unusual for an organism not to have the rates of mortality differ by age. In fact, it's maybe with the exception of hydras, it's kind of not possible. Obviously, age matters with respect to reproductive behaviors and reproduction itself. So obviously, one way you might want to think, well, why don't we just classify them as pre-reproductive, reproductive, and then if they don't die, post-reproductive? I've long told students that the reason older men in their 50s typically wear black socks and Bermuda shorts and sometimes even dress shoes, which, let's face it, look god awful, is because they just don't care. They are clearly post-reproductive. They're not trying to compete for a mate anymore. And so all the rules are off. And whether or not you believe that explanation, I'm going to tell you, I think it is the best. I think the ecological explanation is the best explanation for really bad clothing choices. Okay. One term that you will hear that has a specific meaning is the term senescent. Usually, senescent means post-reproductive. And usually the implication is for senescent organisms or populations is that they're on their way out. This is a widely distributed species of fly. Its scientific name's Delia platura. It's called the seed corn maggot, which is not a good name for it because really it can be a pest of pretty much anything that has a seed in the soil. But truthfully, they're kind of detritivores. They'll feed on all sorts of decaying vegetative matter. And the females are attracted to that when they lay eggs. But interestingly, if there's not a lot of decaying vegetative matter, they can preferentially go to developing seeds. Apparently, they smell some of the chemicals that are associated with seed germination. Anyway, the life cycle and some basic information on these guys wasn't worked out, and that's what I did my master's work on. And I knew that if I was going to say they appear in the spring, disappear in the summer. And so I had to figure out what they were doing the rest of the time, how many generations there were per year. And so one thing I knew I would have to do is figure out what ages they were, specifically the adults when I caught them, because I could figure out whether they're young or old, whether they laid eggs or not. I could then go and try to discern where the generations were. As it turned out, we made an interesting discovery, which is not unusual. It turns out they undergo a weird life cycle called estival hibernation. They don't tolerate warm temperatures very well. So in about June, they disappear and they enter a diapause, hibernating state that lasts all the way till the following spring. There aren't that many organisms that do that, so I thought that was kind of cool. All right, back to my example. Ordinarily, you collect your subjects, and you might, if you're doing with something like plants or insects or what have you, where you're going to be taking many samples, it's ideal to store those, and then you can work on them at their leisure. If you're unfortunately working with vertebrates, God, there's a whole variety of horrible things you do. You might have to extract a tooth, you might have to use some measurement. Sometimes people have worked out certain, they're called morphometrics, where you measure one or more features on the animal, and assuming they have a normal diet, that can be used in an equation to correspond to age. In the case of flies, I knew that there were methods developed for mosquitoes, so I tried to see if I could use the same methods for these flies. And my second or third scientific paper was actually on how you age grade these flies and what it represented and that jazz. So what I discovered was, to do the age grading, I had to look at internal tissues, and they did not respond well to being frozen, and they also didn't respond well to being in alcohol, which meant that I had to collect them and do all of my dissections and age grading the same day. Slave to those flies every other day from the 1st of March till June. Every other day I had to go collect my flies from multiple sites where I was sampling them, bring them to the lab, and do my dissections right away. And what I distinctly recall, and this should be a lesson for those of you doing research, in the second year of my study, we had a sudden snowstorm in Ames, Iowa in April, and I knew there couldn't be any flies, but I had to drive to every one of my fly traps so I could personally say that they were filled with snow and there was a 0, because I didn't want to have any assumptions in my data. And I'm apparently proud of that fact, which is why I'm sharing. Okay, so I brought them back to the lab. I jab a pin through their thorax. I pull the end out. How do I know it's male or female? Oh, here's a trick with lots of flies. The males have huge eyes that touch in the middle, and the females have separated eyes. It's called holoptic versus dicoptic, and it's true for lots of insects. And I can tell you the easy way to remember it: the males are looking for girls, so they have the bigger eyes. And so for lots of insects, and especially true with flies, you can easily sex them just by looking at the eyes. So I pulled out the ovaries. So Those are fly ovaries. They have a common ovipositor. I would say it took me about 20 or 30 dissections before I got pretty good at it. But, and I'm going into detail about this simply because I'm trying to share with you some of the features of what it's like to really do research. So there's a red box floating around either in the lab or my office that's my dissecting kit that dates all the way back from my grad school days. And in there I have something called iridectomy scissors. I spent $20 when that was a lot of money to me, and I got under a microscope with an Arkansas stone and some oil, and I sharpened and sharpened the tips of those under the microscope until microscopically they met and were sharp. And then if anybody went near them, I absolutely went berserk because I was worried they'd drop them and I'd have to go through that process again. The other trick for making microdissecting tools is I took a bunch of pins, held them up over the floor, and just dropped them or threw them on the ground. Then I'd pick them all up, go to the scope, and see if I had any that curved in hook shapes, because then I could use those as tools to pull stuff apart. Anyway, what's the point of all this? Like lots of organisms, insects have 2 sets of ovaries. They have 2 lateral oviducts. They come down. The eggs will come down, pass through here. Yeah, what are these black spots? Oh, the black spots are cool. Remember I mentioned the sperm football? Yeah, there it is. This is an example of a female who's mated. This is the interesting thing about pulling these guys out. I can tell how developed the eggs are. Each of these is a follicle, and you can see how there's a developing egg here, there's a fully developed egg here, la la la. These things are the little ductwork that insects have that brings oxygen to their tissues. They're called tracheoles. They literally extend into holes in the side of the insect. So, if you look at a normal fly, those things are wrapped tightly around the ovaries because they have a huge oxygen demand. These things apart, hacking away at this. Nope, they were actually spread out. The reason they're spread out is because this fly had laid a batch of eggs before I ever dissected it. This is the second batch of eggs. And there's another really cool way I know. This thing is called a follicular relic, and it's where there used to be an egg there. The egg passed out, but there was so much tissue, it just collapsed on itself. And under the scope, you can kind of see it in this slide. This is yellow compared to that white. Think for a moment of how small a mosquito is. You can determine how many times most mosquito species have laid by catching mosquito females and doing the same dissection. And for disease transmission, that information is hugely important. The number of times a female who's infected with a pathogen, pick any pathogen, malaria would be one, or Zika virus, the number of times she can lay has a huge influence on how likely it is, how effective the female is as a vector for disease. So it's a big deal. Anyway, that's what I did. I did a rating system. I used this, and because of this, I knew the female had laid eggs. And in doing that, I could distinguish between old and young females. I could distinguish between those that had not yet laid a group of eggs. One thing I couldn't distinguish was virgin females because there weren't such things. It was clear that the males, it was clear when I started doing these dissections, I just never found any females without spermatophores, which told me those males must be emerging just a little before the females, and they get it on right away, which is not unusual with insects. Species where male development is faster than females, specifically so males get a chance at females just as soon as they're available. Okay? I don't know if that's worth the time I spent, but I enjoyed it. It's a trip down memory lane. Okay. So age grading. When we look at age structure, we will see diagrams that look like these. Sometimes these are called age pyramid. Let's look at this diagram. You'll sometimes see them exactly as triangles, or you'll see them with curves like this. Now you got me paranoid. Yeah, you can see that, right? So, or you'll see these different shapes. They're sort of imaginary, but not entirely. What does 1 represent? A population in which most members are very young. Number 2 represents what's called a senescent population, a population where most members are very old. And number 3 represents a population that is reasonably stable. It's where essentially the numbers dying and the numbers being born are in rough equilibrium. So those 3 sort of imaginary shapes are the shapes you need to know when you look at age structure diagrams. They'll never look exactly like that, but as we're about to see, they'll look something like this. Okay? If you don't memorize the shapes, it doesn't matter, because you should know, well, they're young at the bottom, so if there's a huge number of young, presumably they're going to get older. And at the top, if there's a huge number, those are old farts like Higley, and they're going to be kicking off any day now. And if you have something in between, you have a reasonably consistent structure. Okay, let's look at a real diagram then from the CIA. And let's see, select a country. Well, in honor of Kelly, I'm not meaning to imply that the rest of you from different countries aren't equally worthy. Honest to God, Kelly, I had no idea that's what the flag of Belgium looked like. Very similar to Germany, that's what I would say. Okay, I guess people have something to do with age, right? Age structure. And look right here, population pyramid. What can you tell me about Belgium and the future of the country of Belgium from that age structure diagram? I can tell you it's not right. You guys do have issues. Okay. I'll show you why I said it's not right. Well, yeah, that's not to be surprised. This is close to what you might anticipate to be a stable age structure diagram. But what surprises me is, look how many very young there are. It's not a truly stable diagram. There's a lot of young in Belgium. And what I was looking for, if I compared it to a country that I thought would have a more stable age structure, like France, France is not quite as, doesn't have the high rate of juvenile reproduction, or production of juveniles, as does Belgium. I would expect for most of the Western democracies, as mature societies, to have something approximating a stable age structure. I think the benchmark used to be the Scandinavian countries. If you looked at Norway, Sweden, Finland, and stable age structures. But I can't use those examples for the same reason that I know, without knowing anything about the political situation in Belgium, why they have a lot of individuals in those low age classes. So here's my question to you. What does this age structure tell me about what's going on in Belgium with respect to their populations? I'll give you a hint. It is not that the Belgians are suddenly having a lot more sex because of the influence of rock and roll or hip hop or whatever else. It's immigration. It's a clear immigration response, and it says that immigrants are presumably producing more offspring. And I'll bet if we looked at what the reproduction rate is of the immigrant population, that's the same reason, because Sweden in particular has been so open to immigrants. You can't look at Sweden now to try to see what the long-term impact of society is, because the influx of immigrants are slightly changing it. Sadly, we can pick any country in Africa. I like Burkina Faso because they speak French, so why not Burkina Faso? Although in honesty, the only African country I've been to is Nigeria. So, but let's look at what the situation in Burkina Faso is. Okay, Burkina Faso. Let me give you a country, another African country I actually know a lot more about than Burkina Faso. Let's look at Ethiopia. And we're going to see Ethiopia looks very similar to Burkina Faso. Okay. Tell me what the future is in Ethiopia, and I will tell you if you're right or wrong. I can tell you the political future of Ethiopia. I can tell you a whole bunch of things from this age structure diagram, and you guys can too. Now, I have a little more knowledge than you have, which is important. The total population of Ethiopia in 2016 matters for our interpretation. So let's just see what that is. 105 million people. The reason I know a lot about Ethiopia is I have a very good friend, Fikru Haile, who was one of my PhD students. Fikru's from Ethiopia, and so besides what I've read and had conversations with Fikru, here's what I know about Ethiopia. There's a concept we've not discussed yet, which is carrying capacity. How many organisms will a certain habitat support? The last time I checked, it was widely, the best estimate for the human carrying capacity of Ethiopia is 75 million people, which means that Ethiopia has the capacity to feed up and support 75 million people. They have 105 million people, so how is it that they could have The answer is they import food. Food's the limitation, so they obviously are importing food. So what do I know from this age structure diagram about what will happen in Ethiopia? And it's also what will happen in Burkina Faso and most of the countries in Africa. Not so much in Central Africa as we could see. Well, what proportion of the population is pre-reproductive? A huge proportion. Those look like the diagrams. It's a very juvenile population, which means they will move up into reproductive age. So what does that mean to what will happen to the population? It will explode. And it is exploding. That population's not going to stop at 105. I can't give you the exact projection rate, but I'm sure the CIA analysts can. If we took some time looking at data from year to year, we could. Yes, ma'am. An excellent, excellent question. Does the fact that you have so many young, how is it affected by the mortality rate? So if you have a country with high mortality versus low mortality, don't we see a difference? Here's a very sobering fact. To significantly affect human population growth, you have to have very high mortality. So what we would find if I had looked at Zaire or Uganda, countries that were heavily, heavily affected by AIDS, and you can do this as an assignment, you will see that there's a curious gap in the age structure that represents all the people who died from AIDS when they were reproductive. And what you will see then below that is that they have huge bases. So unless that mortality factor continues, that will continue to come up. I guess I've spent more time on this than I anticipated, but that's okay, because it's important. This is one of the few areas in ecology where looking at a single thing, the size of populations, the demographics, and just a few things about the country, you can make very reliable predictions. So for example, in the case of Belgium, I don't know this. Kelly, how big a political issue is immigration in Belgium? Of course it's a serious issue because you can see how it's affecting the population dynamics of the country. It became a serious issue in Sweden, and in fact, the liberal democracies in Sweden, the most liberal societies on the planet, have had strong conservative movements as out of concerns that allowing this large level of immigration may change the nature of their societies. I'm not talking about the crazy immigration bait in this country. When you're talking about a few percentages, I'm talking about a society where they're taking in 20, 30% of their population. Our debate is trivial compared to what they have there, in my opinion, just based on numbers. Okay. This tells us what the future is. There is no force that's currently operating to reduce the reproductive rates. So it is inevitable that those populations will increase. And we also know that we have limited sources with which to feed them. So, yeah. So one of the things we're going to talk about that's true of all populations is they do not grow indefinitely. That's exactly this phenomenon of population regulation. As they increase, any population will outstrip its resources unless it's checked. There are fundamentally two ways that populations are checked. One is through mortality, from predators, from disease, or what have you. But if that doesn't drop a population or slow its increase, at the top limit, a population will always, without exception, collapse. What causes the ultimate collapse of any population if it's not predators, it's not disease? Keep going. It could be starvation, but that's not the only mechanism. I'm sorry? Not low birth rates, not necessarily age. I want you to think of the ecological phenomenon. Because starvation is a form of mortality, but let me back up and say starvation works, but here's what the real issue is. At the point where you have starvation occurring, you can find a species or a population will go to extinction. Why? Because they compete for the resource and no individual gets enough resource to actually complete their development. What does it mean in human terms? It means that you get war. There's a point of view to which I subscribe that we have already seen this happen in Africa. That the mass killings in Central Africa were in fact not because of tribal rivalries or anything else. They were a classic demographic form of competition that arose because the population was so high over its carrying capacity, there weren't resources that competition occurred.